is, we're the first to say that this is not ideal. We had actually delayed this work session for a few meetings with the hope that we could be back in the council chambers for this topic, because it is very important. It's the first of several joint city council and planning commission meetings that we'll be having over the coming months. As I think many of you know, the comprehensive plan, or master plan as it's sometimes called, is a critical planning component and vision component really for the city of Evans. Cities usually do this either, some every 5 years, but definitely 5 to 10 years. So this is a very important process that you'll be hearing about tonight and engaging in. We have with us tonight representatives of the State Demographer's Office. One of the fundamental components of a comprehensive plan is an understanding of who we are today. So that's, we thought, a fitting way to kick off the process. You'll then also hear an overview of the process that we'll be using, and I believe some of the community engagement process and tools that we plan to use to get more people involved. So with that, I will turn it over to our Community Development Director, Ann Best Johnson, who will introduce our other guests and the Planning Commission, and also facilitate the rest of this work session tonight. Ann, take it away.
Thank you very much, Mayor Rudy and members of City Council. It's with a lot of pent-up excitement and bottled energy that we're here to kick off the master planning process tonight. And again, we are so excited that Planning Commissioners Oxinger, Bernardo, and Ussery are here with us this evening to join the City Council members. So while we had wanted this to be an in-person meeting, as Jim indicated, the nimbleness of Evans really is allowing us to proceed, and we're going to have to give each other virtual high fives for this joint work session and celebrate a job well done. So over the next few weeks and into June, we will be soliciting for steering committee members and performing the work related to the water conservation chapter in the comprehensive plan, or the master plan. And one of the first steps of a master plan is a process called current state analysis. And some of the best people to help us along this process really are the members of DOLA, the Division of Local Affairs, and especially the State Demographer's Office. We couldn't do this without them. So we have wonderful representatives with us this evening. Cindy DeGrone is a state demographer. We also have Chris LeMay, who is the new North Central Regional Manager for DOLA. And we may have Robert Thompson on the telephone as well, and he is the Field Services Regional Assistant for North Central Colorado. And with that, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to them. One thing I do ask you all tonight is, I know it's going to be really exciting and you're going to want to ask questions about the information that's being presented. In essence of time, we really would like you to hold your questions till the end of the presentation, because what we might find is that the answers are on the very next slide, and this will help us keep on task. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cindy, and thank you all again for attending. So Cindy, if you are there, we cannot hear you.
We also cannot see Cindy if she's available. She can turn her camera on.
Well, her name is listed, so
okay.
There she goes.
I think I got unmuted. And then we've just got here we go. So hopefully you can see me now as well as hear me. Yes. Great. So I'll go ahead and start the presentation. Thank you so much for having our office here tonight. This is very important to us that we get to assist you in this process. And thank you to Anne. She's been absolutely fantastic to work with through the design of this presentation and some of the information I get to present tonight. So certainly, as you know, we think about where we are right now, the presentation titled Growing Forward, so Population and Economic Trends in Evans and Weld County, and you'll notice the date of March, which is when we hoped to be able to get together, but we've introduced some additional slides since then, so we'll talk about what's happened and where we are in the current recession. Some of the slides, in the interest of time, I will be skipping over just because they're self-explanatory, I think. But certainly at the end, we'll have time for questions, and then my email address is also included in the presentation, and I am more than happy to participate as we go forward as well. So I'm the projections demographer in the office. So I've spent the last 25 years projecting Colorado's population. And I can tell you sort of the biggest issue that I tend to have is that I never know what year it is. Because I'm always looking at historical data or looking at data for the future. But I can tell you with absolute certainty, it is May 2020 right now. I think the world has slowed a little bit for all of us, and we're watching daily at some of those new numbers that are coming out and what that might mean for Colorado moving forward. But certainly where we were, population growing at a slowing rate. So this is true for the United States and for Colorado as well. And it's mainly due to our age distribution that population growth is slowing. And then concentrated growth, this is new. What we've seen since 2010 is 95% of all growth to the state of Colorado has located along the Front Range. That's significantly different from what we've seen in the past, where more like 85% of the growth has located along the Front Range. But the good reasons for that, and we'll talk about that. Certainly population changes because of three things: a birth, a death, or a mover. And so that migration, attracting and retaining the best and the brightest, is something we've talked about a lot this decade. And so in particular for the migration and movers coming in, at the end of 2019, Colorado actually had the lowest unemployment rate it has ever had since they started calculating the unemployment rate. And so finding those workers was very important and a big issue that we've had this decade. And certainly that's changed in the last month. And the movers that moved to Colorado, Colorado's somewhat unique in that when you read in the newspaper that we're growing jobs, understand that means we're growing population also. So because folks move to Colorado for jobs. Our fastest growing industries so far this decade have been health service, and that's actually due to our age distribution. Professional services, and then accommodations and food service. And we certainly know accommodations and food service hit very hard this last month during the recession, but health services was the second hardest hit. And that, when you think about it, having the chiropractor's offices and the dentist offices and the other offices closed as well. But aging, so for every presentation I've given this past decade, I think I've said that aging is the most significant demographic factor impacting Colorado's growth this decade, and certainly the nation's as well. And I'm going to continue to say it again next decade. So we'll look at that age distribution, but about half of those baby boomers have aged past the 65 line. We've got the other half yet to go, and certainly it impacts everything. And then that increasing racial and ethnic diversity is the story I think we're going to be telling more about this next decade. And that's mainly because Colorado is much more diverse for its younger population than it is for its older population. But as they age into adulthood, we'll see much more significant racial and ethnic diversity across the state. But for the big picture, the US population reached 328.2 million in 2019. That was a growth rate of 0.5%. That was the slowest growth rate that the United States has seen since 1918. Last year, it was 0.6%. And to find one that slow, we had to go back to 1936. Colorado's population reached just under 5.8 million. That ranked us as 8th fastest growing and 7th in our total growth. And that wasn't a surprise. Colorado's been in the top 10 this whole decade. But when we look at that growth by county, those largest gains, the largest gainer was Denver, City and County of Denver, with just under 11,000 persons, but then followed by Weld. Weld's certainly been in that top number for decades, actually, and being one of the fastest growing. So you'll note that growth rate of 3% for Weld, much faster than many of the other counties along the Front Range. And so certainly the fastest, and forecast to continue to be the fastest as well, which we will talk about also. But to put Evans in that picture of Weld County, this chart just shows all places above 10,000 persons and that growth from 2010 to 2018 within Weld. So Weld County growing a total of 24% over that time period. The Colorado during that same time period grew 12%. So as I mentioned, Colorado growing twice as fast as the nation, Weld County growing twice as fast as Colorado. And then we see Evans within that picture growing 2,345 between 2010 and 2018, which is just about 13%. So Evans growing just about half the pace of Weld County. And then as we move forward, let's see if I can get it to, there we go. Here is a chart of what that population growth for Evans looks like from 2000 to 2018. And you can see the much more significant, faster growth that Evans received in the early 2000s versus where we've been the last 5 to 10 years, which has been still growth, but slower than what we'd seen historically. If we were to look at that total population change in Colorado by county, so the counties on this map are colored in terms of the total numbers of persons that have relocated to those areas or that growth within those areas. And every county who's at red, orange, or yellow has a larger population in 2018 than they did in 2010. Counties that are any shade of blue or gray all have smaller populations than they did in 2018. And so you can just see that concentrated growth along the Front Range that has occurred over time. But to understand where we are in Colorado, I think it's helpful to take a step back. This chart begins in 1970 and goes through 2019 and has one bar representing the total growth in Colorado over that year, and the bar is color-coded, such that the movers are color-coded in red, and then what we call natural increase, or the births minus death, is the blue part of the bar. And what we can see right away is that in the 1970s, Colorado was a very attractive place to be. And who was the young mobile generation of that time? They were the baby boomers. And Colorado had a large number of baby boomers move to the state during that time period. And then we see the time period of the late 1980s, the only time period on this chart where we had more people move out of Colorado than move in. And that, if you recall, was the natural resource bust. Colorado's economy was highly concentrated in the oil and gas industries at that time, and there were better opportunities for those persons who lost their jobs in oil and gas in Colorado and other parts of the United States, namely California. So we lost a lot of our residents to California. And then we see that time period of the really strong growth of the 1990s. If you were here during that time period, it was sort of that growth that was never going to end until it did, of course, and it ended in the early 2000s with the tech bust, which was very Front Range centric. And then I'm often asked the question, where on this chart do we see the Great Recession? And certainly we continued to grow throughout the entire Great Recession, and for a couple good reasons. While Colorado had lost over 100,000 jobs in construction and manufacturing, we continued to grow jobs in professional and business and health services. And there was a skills mismatch there, and it was also a nationwide recession in those other industries. And so there weren't better opportunities elsewhere. So they tended to stay, and we attracted folks in who had the skills to take the healthcare and professional services jobs. So certainly our economy, when we talk about Colorado's population, we can't talk about it without talking about the economy, just given how highly correlated those migrants are to what's happening in the job market. And so how will that population and demand for workers be impacted by our current recession? The way we've been talking about it in the office, there are three things that could happen. Number one, not much, maybe a little bit slower since job growth has slowed, including increases in automation. Number two, we could get more migrants. Places harder hit will move to Colorado and telework. Here comes New York. Certainly New York donates the largest number of residents to Colorado, relative to those we send out. So we actually get a larger number from Texas, California, and Washington, but a lot of Coloradans move to Texas, California, and Washington, where not a lot of Coloradans move to New York. Colorado is still a relative bargain for those from New York, and so that could certainly give us some upward pressure on those that might move here. We also have the chance that we might see lower migration. The case that someone shared an apartment with 3 others downtown to enjoy the nightlife and recreation. This is no longer worth it. I'm moving back to Iowa. And then, of course, I just lost my job staying in Colorado, but living in my parents' basement again. So certainly having some of that upward pressure as well as downward pressure, we're really thinking we're going to land somewhere in the middle with that number 1, not much. We might have a little slower net migration since that job growth has slowed over time. But this is Weld County's population growth. So a similar chart, also beginning in 1970 and going through 2019. And you can see that the growth in Weld County from movers really started to kick into high gear at the beginning of the 1990s and has continued since. We saw a little bit of a decline or a little bit slower growth during the Great Recession, but since that time, the growth has really continued to step up within the county. And the other item of note is that blue bar, the natural increase. So Weld and Adams County happen to be the 2 youngest counties along the Front Range. And so still seeing some very strong growth from births, given the fact that there's a larger share of the population within those childbearing age groups, and smaller number of deaths, relatively speaking, just because you are younger. And so not as large of a share of the population subject to higher mortality where you see those deaths. So certainly that births minus deaths will continue to contribute to Weld's population growth and is one of the reasons why we see Weld County growing as strongly as it does moving out into the future. This is another way to look at that. The births are the blue line and the deaths are the red line. The dotted areas are our projections. And so we just see those strong projections for the births, a slight increase in the deaths. Everyone's living longer. We all get to have more birthdays. We do have higher life expectancy, just a larger share of the population within those older age groups, which are subject to higher mortality. So deaths should continue to increase over time, but that gap growing, and that's just that contribution to the population. So the births highly outnumbering the deaths, where if this was a presentation, say, for Jefferson County, those 2 lines actually flip, and we have more deaths than births starting in about 2030 for both Jefferson County and Boulder County as well, which will significantly slow their growth because they'll need folks to move in just to keep the population stable. But not the case for Weld County. And I mentioned that concentrated growth earlier, and this chart helps us understand why. When we look at our 2018 jobs relative to our pre-recession peak, and so this was pre-Great Recession, every county in this chart in red, orange, or yellow having more jobs in 2018 than they had pre-recession, and all the counties on this map in blue or gray having fewer jobs in 2018 than they did at the start of the Great Recession. So you'll note the Western Slope, which had a bunch of oil and gas activity on it prior to the Great Recession, and all of that activity has actually moved from the Western Slope really into Weld County at this point, and those jobs not expected to go back over there, but are in Weld County, although we know what's happened to the oil and gas industry over the last month. So when we look at Weld County's total employment by industry and wage, we've got the construction as the largest industry within Weld County, followed by manufacturing, retail trade, local government, health services, and then accommodation and food. And those lines are color-coded by wage. And so those orange lines representing the lower wage jobs, the purple line, the strong mid-wage jobs, and then the green, the high-wage jobs, which we see mining just after accommodation and food services. But if we were to look at how this has changed over the last decade, certainly mining being the largest increase in jobs within Weld County from over the last decade, followed by a strong rebound in construction, transportation and warehousing growth, accommodation and food services, administration and waste, and then manufacturing. So the majority of those being in high wage or mid-wage jobs, although still some of those low wage jobs grew as well, the accommodation and food. and administration and waste. When we think about what's driving the growth and change by county across the state, we identify base industries, what we call base industries. So these are the ones that are bringing in those outside dollars and fueling the economy. And for Weld County, the top three there: agriculture, commuters, and regional services. When we talk about regional services, we're really talking about insurance, finance, and other retail, where Weld County is really that regional center where folks come in to shop. The commuters is, a lot of people don't think of it as an industry, but it brings a lot of money into Weld County. And so to understand that, I pulled together this information on where Weld County residents work. And then we're going to look at Evans here in a minute. But we can see within Weld County, each one of those on the map on the right, each one of those purple dots represents where a Weld County resident works. And so you can see that about 40% of Weld County residents work in Weld County. The other 60% work outside of Weld County, everywhere from Wyoming all the way down to Colorado Springs. And then another way to visualize that is that bar, or the two circles in the upper left-hand corner, where the light green circle represents the workers in Weld County, and the dark green circle represents the jobs in Weld County. And so where those two intersect is where you have someone who lives and works in Weld County. So you can just see that large share of Weld County residents who work outside of Weld County. This is what the map and the same chart looks like for Evans. And so within Evans is outlined there in the yellow, and then you can see where each one of Evans residents goes to every day for work. And so the bigger that dot, the larger number of workers at that location. And so many in Greely, but all the way from Fort Collins down to Highlands Ranch. And so within Evans, about 6% of the population within Evans lives and works in Evans, where 95% work outside of Evans. And so where do Evans residents work? So 30% of them work within the city of Greely, with 2,715, followed by Denver. And then that 6% that work in Evans, followed by Loveland, Fort Collins, Windsor, Aurora, and then other locations as well. And when we want to talk about the industry in Evans, there's the industry of the folks who live in Evans, which is that left-hand panel, the majority of whom are employed in manufacturing, retail trade, and healthcare and social assistance. And then there are the jobs that are within Evans. The number one industry being administration and support, with 22% of the jobs, followed by retail trade, which is 18%, and then the mining, oil, and gas, which is 14%, as well as healthcare and social assistance. And so certainly what we've seen within the state and for other communities as well is just the more diverse in terms that you can make those jobs, the more resilient you can be throughout any downturn. So this one in particular hitting the retail trade, accommodation and food services, and the mining, oil, and gas quite hard. But age, I absolutely can't not talk about age. It's so important to the state and to Evans as well in terms of the preferences where people shop and what they buy. Certainly a household headed by someone over the age of 65 spends their money differently than does a household headed by someone ages 25 to 35. They also have different types of housing that they're interested in. Their labor force participation, very different. Income, whether you're in your peak earning years or whether you're spending down your savings, as well as different service demands. So within Weld County, this is a picture of the age distribution of Weld County residents. So hopefully you can find yourself somewhere on this chart, and it's color coded by generation. And so the chart begins at age 0 and it ends at age 90. I had a woman in a presentation last week who was over age 90. So I'm going to extend this chart to age 100 here soon. But the oldest generation on this chart, the silent generation, these were the babies born during World War II and the Depression, and there just weren't very many of them. And then following that, we see the baby boomers in purple, and I put in a big black line to represent age 65. So we can kind of see how half the baby boomers have aged past that 65 line. And then we see Generation X, or who was originally named the baby bus, and then millennials, who are currently the largest generation in the United States and in Colorado as well, followed by the post-millennials, or what they've really called Gen Z at this point. And then you can see the college students in that population as well within Weld County. But when we talk about Evans, Evans is even younger than Weld. So Evans in the blue line, in the blue bar, and then Weld County in the green bar. And you can just see how much larger a share of Evans population is in that 20 to 29-year-old age group versus even Weld County, which happens to be one of the youngest counties along the Front Range. And then also you see sort of that mirror of their children behind them in the 0 to 9-year-old age group. And so that strong growth in large part due to that younger age distribution that's still within those childbearing age groups. When we look forward and think about how the population is going to change, our forecast for Weld County was to grow by 24% by 2025. And certainly you see every age group growing at about that same percentage. Those older age workers, 55 to 64, growing a little slower, but that's that baby bus generation moving in and replacing the baby boomers who are aging out of that age group. But we see that strong aging into the retired population. So not a big number within Weld. Like I mentioned, Weld is young, but it is going to see the strongest growth. So those biggest changes happening for your oldest residents, aged 75 and over. And then what I've called here our long-term care population. This one I was really excited about just because the baby boomers aren't there yet. That's our increased life expectancy. That's just because we all get to have more birthdays that we're seeing those increases in those residents. Ethnicity and race, I'm not going to present these slides. They're fairly self-explanatory. I just wanted to include them because the share of the Hispanic, Black, Asian, and American Indian population within the state is so much different for our youngest residents versus our oldest, where you can see 43% under the age of 18 versus 17% 65 and over, and what that means for the working age population. This chart, I just wanted to make sure and reiterate that when we look at our forecast, we absolutely do it with the job forecast in addition to the population as well. And I'm going to skip over that one and just look to where in our forecast we're expecting that population to reside. So we currently have 2.4 million people forecast to join Colorado's population by 2050. And certainly the majority of that growth occurring along the Front Range. So 2 million of it along the Front Range, 1 million in the Denver metro area, and then 1 million split between the North Front Range and the South Front Range. But certainly the North Front Range, we're expecting to get the lion's share of that number with about a 600,000 increase in Weld County growing more than any other county in the state between now and 2050. When Ann and I were first talking, it was this idea of how the city of Evans, so our office does not do population forecasts at the municipal level because it's so dependent on the decisions that each municipality makes. But we wanted to pull together a few numbers just to give you an idea of what a few scenarios might look like. And certainly that dark part of the line represents growth that's already occurred within Evans. That top red line that gets up to 48,500. So this is the average annual growth that Evans has experienced since 2000. So if we include those really strong growth years for Evans in the early 2000s, this is where the population would end up if that just continued. The blue line represents a projection about 3%. That's on average what Weld County has grown over this last decade. And Evans is about 6% of the share of Weld's growth if we go over the long term and look at how much has gone in. And if that continues, you get to about 36,000. And then Evans has also declined somewhat as a share of the total population in Weld. And if those declines continue, then Evans would end up about 20,000 in 2040. So certainly, what are the impacts that we're looking at from the current time period that we're in? An annual GDP drop of 5 to 7% in 2020. This would be the largest since 1946. A peak unemployment of 15%. When I looked a couple days ago, Colorado was sitting at 11. We're thinking that's going to happen around the second quarter in 2020, but that the unemployment rate could remain elevated near 10% through 2020. And certainly consensus forecasts across the United States are calling for house prices to fall about 4% over the next 18 months. And that's US-wide. We're not certain Colorado would fall that much. The biggest drops I've seen from any economist is about 8%. And certainly we don't think Colorado would be among one of those, that it would be actually less than that. And decreased consumption is so important given the fact that 70% of our economy is from consumer expenditures. So we've got 10 trillion in wealth loss and some consumers becoming bigger savers. And then of course the state budget, and I'm certain your budget as well, being cut right now and then possibly being cut even further once we move out 2021, 2022. And then we also expect to see a continued increase in multi-generational households. So certainly we've seen some of that happen over the last decade, and in particular in Colorado as housing prices have gone up quite significantly, and so that is likely to continue. But then the uncertainty in various recovery scenarios, this is sort of the alphabet soup of the recovery. Will it be a V, a U, a W, an L? I think the consensus right now is it's going to look more like a Nike swoosh. So we're going to come down, but then we're going to go up, but that going back up is going to be gradual over time. And so I'm happy to answer any questions. I've left a couple other slides on the end here in terms of what likely will be. I've talked about what are some of the big risks to the state forecast. Certainly the Census 2020 is important if you've filled out your census already for your community. But I think we have a few minutes for questions.
We sure do. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting. Learned a lot from that. Let's start with the Planning Commission. Steve, do you have any questions, or Lyle, or anyone else from the Planning Commission? Mr. Ursay?
I guess I don't really have any questions. I mean, they do. Cindy, you guys do such a great job of presenting this. I'm sure you've anticipated many of the questions. Just tell me real quick, with what we've seen going on with gas and oil, do you project that to continue in its current decline, or do you anticipate that coming back?
Well, some of it, certainly the way we've talked about it in the office, and then I think the consensus that I've heard from a lot of folks is that as we start to consume more, once the economy opens up a bit, certainly we don't expect to see continued declines. But the fear is that we will lose, upwards of 20% or more of the companies that were related to oil and gas in this very significant downturn that we've had. And so certainly not continued declines is not what folks are thinking. They are thinking more of a leveling out, but then that consumption and that return to consumption will be important in that. Makes sense.
Okay, I appreciate that, because I know part of Evan's revenue is largely dependent on gas and oil, so I'm a little concerned about that, and I think we need to keep that in mind. But thank you for answering the question.
Absolutely, you're welcome.
Thank you. Any other questions from Planning Commission? Hearing none. City Council, if you want to follow the same procedures we do during our meeting, just hit your raise hand button. Councilwoman Johnson.
Cindy, I have a question. In the projections for population forecast, you had mentioned that the city of Evans is projected approximately a 6%, but you also mentioned in the event of a decline that approximately by 2040, we would go down to 20,000 in population. What would cause that? Would it be migration?
Okay, and that's 25,000. So that's not a down, it's still up. It's just a really slow up. It's a very low up. And so what I mentioned is going down is that Evans has declined as a share of Weld County's population. If we go back to 2000, Evans was about 7% of the county's total population, and currently it's more like 6.3% of the county's total population. And so if that share of Weld was to continue to decline, then we'd be at about 25,000 by 2040, which would still be a slight increase over where the population is today. So it would almost be stability moving forward. When we talk about the fastest growth on this projection of about 3.9% per year, that would incorporate much of the strong growth that, as you can see on that curve going from 2000 to 2005 for Evans County, very strong growth during that time period. So if we average that out with some of the less strong growth that we've seen more recently within Evans, then we would end up with the 48,500. So growth in all of these scenarios, I don't imagine a scenario where Evans is going to end up smaller than it is today, but certainly you could see a scenario where if, for example, no new housing is built, that the population would certainly decline less, because you're still going to have kids born into some of the households, but then you'd also incorporate some of the aging where the kids might move out, grow up and move away. And so more of a stabilized population. I hope, did that answer your question?
It did. It did. And the reason why I was asking is because of just future project, projections, and really getting a grasp of what our growth will be, considering the current situation. That might look a little different, but I'm just hopeful that we still have, an increase, but not a substantial decline to where we have to readjust all of our projections moving for infrastructure or any other projects that we're currently looking at.
Right. Well, I can tell you, I absolutely do not think the population will decline. I don't see a scenario where that could potentially happen, especially given your age distribution. With the young population, that natural increase is such a strong contributor to the growth in addition to movers. So.
But thank you for that.
Sure.
Councilwoman Spear, do you have questions or comments?
Thank you. I do not right now.
Okay. Councilwoman Castle.
Yeah, I think my question is, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how in my head to phrase this so that it makes sense. I apologize. When you're looking at the trends by age, and we notice that we've got a significant amount in that 20 to 29 range, do you know, or is there something that would tell us, as people age, are they moving away, or has there been an influx of younger individuals over the past 10 years or something? The reason I wonder that from council perspective is really looking at it from the perspective of retaining residents.
Right. I certainly appreciate the question. Thank you for it. When we look at migrants I'll start just with the state of Colorado. They tend to be young. The majority of migrants that move to Colorado are between the ages of 25 and 35. When we look at, say, the city and county of Denver, they're all in their 20s. When we look at Weld County, it's really young families, where you get some of those college students, but then you also get the 25 to 35, and then they've got their mirror of their children behind them. And so that's really within Evans. What we see, the migrants that you tend to attract are those young families, young adults as well as young families. And there's an affordability that exists within Weld County that doesn't in a lot of other parts of the metro area. So that's why you see a lot of that the jobs that they're taking are outside of Weld County, but certainly Weld County is their choice for where they would like to live. Very attractive to young families, certainly. And so that is that 20 to 29, and then as well as part of that 30 to 39 are the folks who are attracted to Weld County. And so it is harder to see some of those folks leaving Weld County. I would assume many of them, you will retain many of them as long as those services are there for persons who are also becoming young parents. So one of the things I often talk to with local governments about is making sure they've got those daycares and making sure they've got the good schools. because that is one of the biggest pieces in being able to attract and retain some of these young families as their families develop a little bit further, is to make sure and have those particular services strong within the community. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Cindy, I don't think if you could see it. I saw Mr. Oxinger ask a question on the chat there. I don't know if that's for now or for later. But if you answer that there.
Sure. Number of retirees. Oh, absolutely. And so yes, without a doubt, I would argue that the number of retirees is going to increase statewide. And so Evans will be no exception. When we look at this current chart, what we see is that 60 to 69-year-old age group, that's still very significant and much larger than the 70 to 79-year-old age group, where we've definitely got folks retired. So folks are working longer in life, and that's partially due to the fact that we still feel good at those age groups, or at that age. We've got that longer life expectancy, so we both might want to as well as need to continue working longer. In addition to this current recession, folks may decide to stay in the workforce a little bit longer, but absolutely will see an increase in that retiree number. There is that service demand that comes with that retiree, but I always look on the flip side as well and think about the fact that they're also incredibly recession proof. And so during this downturn, those households that will fare the best are those that are not dependent on earned income. And so those that are spending down savings, or that are receiving Social Security or pensions or other items, that they really are quite recession proof over in that, even though they do utilize more of the services as well, typically within a community, but then can be great contributors as well, because they're the ones who are continuing to spend money on groceries and whatnot that as they would have before.
Great, thank you. We really only have about 2 or 3 more minutes. Is there anyone else from the Planning Commission that'd like to comment or have any questions?
Staff has 3 slides that we would just like to quickly run through.
Yep, I was going to call on
close
Jim
us out.
next.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. Is there anyone else from Planning Commission? And Allie, I see you have one more quick question. Please make it short.
So just lastly, kind of adding to what I mentioned earlier, considering that most of our residents in Evans, I think, 94% live, work outside of Evans. Considering the situation that we have now with a lot of the industries that have been impacted, how do you foresee that impacting the city of Evans, considering that these young families are leaving to these jobs, and now with potential loss of jobs, how would that impact us moving forward in our projections? Questions directed to Cindy.
Cindy, I think your mic's off if you're flipping through those. Cindy, if you can hear us, I don't think your mic's working. Let's go ahead and turn it over to you, Jim. Sorry, Councilwoman. We'll get an answer to that, Councilwoman Johnson.
And I will transition quickly to Ann, but I just want to mention all of this data. This was a lot of great, rich Evans level data, which took a long time, and there's a lot of good data there. This is just the first kind of salvo for this. This data will be integrated into the process that Ann will outline now. And this won't be the last time that we see this data and can ask questions and have conversation about what it means for us. So with that, Ann, if you could just take a brief minute to outline process.
Sure, thank you, Jim. So as discussed, Starting in May, we are going to be soliciting for stakeholder team members from both City Council, Planning Commission, and the public. And then we will start into the water conservation chapter, heading into the trails and transportation chapters. And then we'll find out from DOLA if we were successful or not in our grant. And then we can outline the rest of the comprehensive plan based on the outcome of our grant award or not. So we have branded this exercise as Explore Evans, where rivers and opportunity meet. And this theme was selected to reflect the significant natural history behind the city's location at the confluence of both the Big Thompson and the South Platte Rivers, and also to signify the importance of the master plan to guide the future's growth. So tonight really was that true kickoff for the current state analysis. And again, the next steps include that solicitation for stakeholder group, drafting that water conservation plan that was given to us from a grant through the Sonoran Institute, and a kickoff to the Transportation and Trails Master Plan. And on the next slide, we'll be able to see some of the early community engagement components that are being developed. So to generate interest in this process, we'd like to put out the flyer that's on the right-hand side for the May utility bill. The front will be in English, the back will be in Spanish. It outlines what is a master plan, the secret behind the Explore Evans brand, and then at a call to action for people to get involved. And at this point in time, those are just a teaser. And I'm going to turn this over to Lauren Richardson, the city's planner, who's going to quickly discuss the initial engagement activities, as well as present a teaser to the final products that will be developed. So Lauren.
Thanks, Anne. So these are some of our public engagement strategies. Each month, they'll showcase a different set of questions for different chapters in the master plan. So the form in the center, which we have the top of right there, will be our paper form that's going to be given out at City Hall. This survey is going to have a little competition behind it between the rec center folks and the front desk folks, seeing whoever gets the most participants of the survey in a month will win a free lunch. So we're aiming at 1,000 residents to participate. I just wanted to mention our GIS analyst created the form on the left, which will be our online survey, trying to get everybody involved. It's also going to be advertised on the city's website. So these questions will stay the same throughout the master plan process. So this will allow the residents to fill out what neighborhood they live in, what they love most about Evans, and what they wish that Evans had. For an example, what do you drive to different communities for? So these questions will direct the focus for the master plan. The results of all these surveys will be displayed on a dashboard on the next slide, right there. Oh, one back. So these are the 3 screenshots from our teaser that will be our final online product. There'll still be a paper copy. This version will just reside online. Our plan is to create a living master plan, a site that will be for the public to see the data from all the surveys and interact with the maps. Yeah, this is our way of trying to get the community engaged and empowered and show them, how this process works. The final product will help convey the goals listed in the master plan, and the product will be retained by the city. This will be created by city staff and will belong to the city. And we have just been using technology that's already, available to us. So no extra money. And that is it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor. That's all from staff.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim. We do need to get moving on to our work session, but I do want to take a moment and thank the Planning Commission for joining us tonight. It's very much appreciated. We can't thank you enough for all you do, and we look forward to working with you guys in the future. We're going to have many more meetings together shortly. So thank you guys for being here, and thank you for everything. So let's go ahead and get started with the city council work session for the city of Evans. Are we staying on this page or are we going to a different one, Karen? We're staying here, correct?
Yes, we're staying here.
Okay. First item on the agenda for the city council work session for May 5th is the COVID-19 response update. We'll hear from staff. Jim?
Thank you, Mayor. Just a brief update, really focusing on any changes since our last work session update. And as Karen's bringing up just a couple slides, I'll remind council that our COVID response update is really anchored in our emergency operations plan, as well as our more detailed pandemic response plan, and that's been guiding our actions. Several weeks ago, we did outline for council that we are kind of midway through our tiers of emergency response. Phase 3, or I guess, yeah, that's in phases. We have not advanced to phase 4, which is good because phase 3 remains as our services are all still operational with the exception of recreation generally, plus a couple more. But we have been working effectively remotely, and the virus and the conditions we've been dealing with have been manageable. So that's good news for us. If we could have next slide, please. This graph is probably starting to look familiar to council, but this is one that we update each day. This just shows our cumulative totals in terms of reported cases in Weld County, and also reported fatalities from COVID-19 in Weld County. Those numbers, as you can see, have been fairly linear for us. So that trend remains. You can see a couple of blips along the way. And then you also see that we're also tracking the number of cases within the 80620 area code, which encompasses most of Evans, really all of Evans, except for Grapevine Hollow, which is in a different zip code. But it gives us an indicator of how Evans is doing. Those numbers have also been fairly steady. We're now at 180 cases in that 80620 Evans zip code. We go to the next slide. This one I think is particularly useful and interesting, and we're going to start sharing this more with council. Just came to our attention. This is our daily stats. So it shows the daily change, for instance, in positive cases in Weld County. That's the most prominent blue line there. And then you can also see the orange bar is the Weld County fatalities from COVID-19. And then the gray bar is the 80620 cases. As we start to want to see whether our trend is flattening or decreasing, hopefully over time, this is probably one we should be looking at. This also denotes the transition from the stay-at-home order from the state of Colorado to the safer at home order that was on April 27th. And the one thing I'll point out here is that the last few days within Weld County, with the exception of May 5th number there, those are lower daily increases than we've been seeing for most of the time we've been dealing with this. So too early to draw any conclusions, but that we want to see those numbers from increasing from 40 a day to hopefully lower than that, certainly, as we start to kind of stem the tide here. Next slide, and I'll conclude. I want to leave a few minutes for questions. Just some highlights for the council. I mentioned no changes in service levels since the last work session update. And for that reason, it's one of the reasons we've been comfortable in a little slower ramp up to our reopening plan of our public facilities on Monday, May 18th. We're wanting to make sure that we have all of our protocols and policies in place to keep employees and the public safe. So that's on track, still pending those numbers that we saw on the last slide. If we're still seeing that trend, we'll keep that date. With the exception to the public facilities reopening, of course, are the recreation facilities, our event facilities and reservations, our playgrounds, our athletic fields, and our municipal court. all of those dates are still subject to more public health information confirmation. When they open, we just want to make sure that we can help keep folks safe, and so we can keep this economy reopening. I think that's all of our number one interest, along with stemming the tide in terms of the virus. I do want to mention to council, we'll have more detail for you over the next week or so, but we were pleased to see that our sales tax revenues for March came in actually on track with our original 2020 budget. Might be a little surprising, but at the same time, we know that we have some strong sales tax generators such as Sam's Club and Walmart, that part of Walmart, I should say. We share that sales tax with Greely. But we do believe, and we still need to confirm, that the very strong performance from those retailers probably offset some losses for us in other sectors. And we are still, our forecast projections haven't changed at this point for the year, and our 5-year forecast model. We think that the sales tax returns for April and May should give us a better indicator of what our next few months could look like, and therefore give us a better platform for planning. Want to mention we are engaged with the Greely Area Recovery Fund for our local businesses. I know that our economic development staff has been reaching out personally. I believe we're over 60 calls now to various businesses in Evans, trying to promote that resource and encourage businesses to participate. This is a program that offers grants in the amount of up to $5,000 for businesses that are particularly affected by the COVID-19 emergency. I understand that we've had, I thought the number was 10. I saw a number today that was 8 applications from Evans businesses. The Recovery Fund has not yet released numbers on those numbers of grants that have been funded. We understand they'll be doing that within the next week or so, but we'll certainly be letting council know about those funded grants once we have that information. And I think good news too, our businesses, we have seen some opening up of the economy, certainly anecdotally over the last few days, but for the most part, the city has, well, not from the most part, the city has not received complaints to this point about businesses that may not be opening safely. So we are proud of all of our businesses that if they're choosing to open, that they're doing that safely so far. So we'll keep you updated on that too. So Mayor, that concludes my report tonight on COVID-19 response.
Great, thank you very much, Jim. Council members, I apologize. There's 33 people in the meeting right now, and on my side, on my list, I don't have all the council members, so I won't see raised hands, so I'm just going to call on each one individually. If you have no comment, please just say no comment, and we'll move on. But we'll start with Mayor Pro Tem Clark.
I have no comments, thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Neal?
No comments at this time, yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Spear?
I think this might be a question that maybe indirectly related to COVID-19, but this is for Jim, based on your response, as far as we have a better March, or right on track with our March taxes. I know Greely has laid off because of COVID, and also because of the oil and gas. They have furloughed employees. Are we looking like we might have to go in that direction, or are we still doing good in that area?
Well, probably a couple points to make there. As I talk with other city managers in the area, I am aware that most cities, and I believe Greely, their focus so far on reducing staffing costs has been in the area of recreation and their cultural services. So I know Evans likewise or similarly has really reduced to zero all of our part-time and seasonal recreation employee hours. We haven't characterized those as layoffs or furloughs. but those hours have reduced to 0. We don't have the same number, certainly, of full-time recreation and other cultural employee staffs that larger communities might, that we're seeing in the news. So I believe that we're pretty well in line in terms of taking some of those proactive, though unfortunate, actions to reduce staff there. But over the next couple months, as we do have better data and more data on our economy, we will be bringing updates to the council. The staff has already taken action to freeze vacancies and put a halt on any really discretionary spending for the year. And we are in the process of doing the planning for other contingencies and scenarios that would be associated with various revenue decreases. For instance, 20%, 30%, what would we have to do in those cases? And unfortunately, in some of those worst case scenarios, staffing reductions could be involved.
All right, thank you. I hope that we don't have to, get to that point. So appreciate everybody that's working here. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Johnson.
I was actually going to also ask the same question Councilmember Spear mentioned. Are we able also to get updates on the areas that were affected as far as the COVID with our staff being decreased? I know that you mentioned it's been part-time and seasonal, but I mean, were the staff that were decreased to 0 in areas that will definitely impact, the city, considering that we are already working with a very limited staff, number? Would that affect any of our departments? And how can we work together to ensure that we minimize that?
Well, Councilmember Johnson, those reduction in hours so far have been correlated to those services that are currently, not available, such as the recreation services, some of our senior services for the senior lunch and those sorts of things. At this point, as I think, I'm very pleased with the way that our staff has been able to, first of all, stay healthy in our areas of first responders, and both our police and our public works employees, but also the way that we've been able to keep services operating remotely. Bills are being received, citizens' questions are being answered, land use cases are being processed. The list, really does go on there. So far, any reductions in hours that we've had have been correlated to those services that unfortunately are fairly, clearly not available now.
Thank you for that. That's all I have.
Thank you. Councilmember Mortensen.
I have no comment.
Thank you. Councilmember Castle.
Yeah, mine just had to do with a little bit of what was just discussed. So Jim, in moving forward with operations of the city, I know when the city has posted online about the city hall being closed and that sort of thing, which I think is a good choice, there has been some negative backlash from some residents, assuming that means that certain city services are not available. Can we just maybe make a public announcement or something that all services are still available, that staff are still working, to nip that in the bud? Because I feel like people are starting to drum stuff up that's not true, and then they're getting mad that they're paying taxes and their bills and not getting the services when really they are. So I would just love to have a positive announcement about, while the community center remains closed, staff are working diligently to ensure that all residents are obtaining the services that they're due.
Certainly we'll do more of that, Councilmember. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from council? Okay, thank you, Jim. Good update. Next item on the agenda, presentation related to the 2019 financial audit. Turn it back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick introduction from me. This audit, as it's always important that we mention, this audit really is the city council's audit of the city's books. The city council periodically reviews the contract for and does select the city's auditor, so that it is independent from staff. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Tyra Litsu from the firm of ACM, a local audit firm who has completed an audit of the city's financial statements for 2019. And per our annual process, the auditor is here. Tyra is here to provide an overview of the audited financial statements to the council tonight. With that, I'll turn it over to Tyra, and then staff is on hand to answer any questions should the council have them, and Tyra request our support.
Good evening. How are you? Thanks for having me on the Zoom call. Sorry, I didn't realize my camera was turned off. But as part of our annual audit procedures, the last piece of our audit is always to present to those charged with governance the results of the audit. It is an interesting time because we are looking at 2019 numbers, and we all know that with the COVID-19, things are changing. But as of 2019, we were able to issue an unmodified opinion. That's a clean opinion. That's what you're always striving to accomplish. So there are two documents that I will address and go through as part of the audit presentation. The first is what we refer to as our audit wrap document. This document is kind of the information as part of our required communications to those charged with governance. It kind of succinctly describes what our audit focus was, what procedures we went through for the audit process. So let me just be able to pull that up. Just starting on page 3 of that document, it does say the status of our audit. We have substantially completed our audit of the financial statements for the year ended December 31st, 2019. The objective of our audit is always to obtain reasonable assurance, not absolute assurance. What that means is, as part of our audit process, we review significant transactions, we select account balances for testing, we do samples of the transactions. So we don't audit every single transaction that the city enters into during the year. The scope of our work was substantially the same as that was described to you in our earlier planning communications. We do expect to issue an unmodified opinion, and we're anticipating that our report date will be May 19th, 2020, because that's when the city council will approve the audit. We do expect to issue an unmodified opinion on those compliance requirements that have a direct and material effect on each major federal program. Since the city does spend more than $750,000 in federal grants, we did perform single audit procedures. So that is also saying that we are expecting an unmodified opinion on those financials or on the single audit procedures. Everything that was requested was made available for our audit, and management's cooperation was excellent. As Jackie can attest, we give her a really long list of items that we ask for as part of the audit, and her team pull all of those transactions for us, in addition to what they're doing on a regular basis. So we do appreciate Jackie and the rest of the finance department's help with the audit this year. And continuing on to the next page, the city's significant accounting practices and policies are included in note 1 to the financials. The city didn't change any significant accounting policies and practices. Also in note 1 talks about the assumptions used in any estimates, and there weren't any changes to any estimates processes for the city. Continuing on that page, like I mentioned, we do a risk-based audit approach where we are looking at the higher dollar balances, some of the higher transactions, some of the things that are identified as a risk to the city. We do look at revenue recognition just because the city has various sources of revenue, including property taxes, sales and use taxes, charges for services. So we look at those various types of revenue streams and we make sure that everything's recorded in the proper year. Accounts receivables do represent amounts that are owed from citizens in terms of property taxes, sales taxes from the businesses. Sometimes there's intergovernmental receivables for, especially on the federal grants, for amounts that have been paid but haven't been received by the other entities. No allowance is made for those receivables as management is deemed that bad debts are unlikely. Capital assets continues to be a large balance for the city, and there's always new transactions and new capital assets that are added. So we do look at the new assets. We also look at repairs and maintenance to make sure that those are properly treated as an expenditure. We also look at depreciation expense. In addition, we look at bonds payables, any other long-term liabilities. So the city does have 3 outstanding Colorado Water Resource and Power Development notes payables, about $38.8 million. So we confirm those balances. There is some debt requirements, covenants as part of that, and we did review those to make sure that they're in compliance with the covenants. As you know, the city does have 2 defined benefit plans administered by FPPA. The city is in both the hybrid as well as the regular statewide defined benefit plan. As such, there is reporting within the government-wide of the city's proportionate share of those plans. In this year, the statewide defined benefit plan did have a liability, so a net pension liability, while the other plan did have a net pension asset. So you'll see both of those reflected on your financial statements. As I indicated, we did perform single audit procedures. We looked at 2 different grants. The grants related to expenditures relating to the 35th Avenue project, as well as the 37th Street utility project. We look at those. We do some testing of transactions as well as other compliance requirements with relating to those major federal awards. We didn't identify any going concern issues, and estimates were determined to be reasonable and free of bias. Attached to the back of this, we do have 1 audit adjustment that we did propose and the city did post, and it had to do with accumulated depreciation. But that is attached to the back of this document. As part of our audit, we are also required to communicate to those charged with governance any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in the internal controls. We gain an understanding of these internal controls as part of our planning process, but we don't actually give an opinion within on the internal controls. As part of our audit, we didn't identify any material weaknesses in those internal controls. The next page just has some other required communications that we are required to communicate to those charged with governance. We didn't have to use anybody outside of the audit team to perform any audits. You know, there was no significant difficulties. And we will ask for a management representation letter as part of our audit process. And we'll get that over to Jackie closer to the date of the auditor's report. Our engagement letter that's dated February 7th is showing that we are both independent in fact and appearance with the city. And the next several pages of this document has to do with new standards that have been implemented or are coming up from GASB. As anybody in the governmental accounting world can attest, GASB does keep both the accounting individuals as well as the auditors on our toes, and there's quite a few things that are being released every year. One of the new standards has to do with certain asset retirement obligations. And in discussions with Jackie, this will probably be implemented or will be applicable to the city in 2020 relating to the decommissioning of the wastewater treatment plant. But right now, just due to the timing and that that's still early in the process, there is not a retirement obligation that's reflected in the financials. And then the rest of them is just some other standards that are coming up. The last page just has some information about some cybersecurity resources that are available to our clients through the BDO Alliance that we're affiliated with. So there's different things that you can go take a look at in terms of any cybersecurity. Does anybody have any questions on that document before I move on to the financials?
Nope, I think we're okay.
Perfect. So the financials I won't go into in a great amount of detail just because there hasn't been that many significant changes in the financial statements from the prior year. There is a new food tax fund within the financial statements. It's considered a non-major fund, so it's combined with the other non-major funds. But on page 72 of the financial statements, you can see the budget to actual statement for that fund. Just the first two pages is our auditor's report. Like I mentioned, it is dated on May 19th, 2020, which is when the City Council will be approving the financials. I do want to point out that in here on the first page of our opinion, we do have an emphasis of matter relating to the COVID outbreak. All of our clients in all markets, we are including that as an emphasis of matter. Just saying that there's a considerable uncertainty as to the financial impact going forward for the city. Starting on page 3 is management's discussion and analysis. I always tell my clients and those charged with governance that I feel like this is probably the most important piece of the financial statements. It gives information from management's perspective of what happened at the city during the year, significant changes, and any items relating to capital assets and debt. It also gives information about, it is the only part of the financial statements that has comparative information. So you'll see both the 2019 and the 2018 information. So I do encourage you to read that. I think it provides in a more layman's terms the activities of the city during the year. I'll just cover some items in the first few statements. You'll see on page 14 for the statement of net position, this shows all of the assets as well as all of the liabilities for both the governmental activities as well as the business type activities of the city. Like I mentioned, there is a net pension asset relating to the hybrid plan for the pension for the police officers, but there's also a net pension liability for the statewide defined benefit plan. Majority of the contributions that the city does have for the pensions is with the hybrid plan, which has that net pension asset. You'll see there's restricted cash equivalents and investments in the governmental activities of $1 million. That's your emergency contingency fund. And there's also some restricted cash and cash equivalents and investments for the business type activities, and that has to do with your debt requirements. On pages 15 and 16 shows information about the changes in your net position. It does show all of the revenues as well as the expenses. In the governmental activities, you'll see that you have a positive net increase in net position of about $6.3 million. And then in your business type activities, it's an increase of about $6.9 million. That just shows on a full accrual basis, you did bring in more revenues than you spent. The last statement I'll go through is just your governmental funds balance sheet and your statement of revenues and expenditures. You'll see for your general fund, you have total fund balance of about $12.5 million. Your other major funds is your street construction, parks construction on that first page, as well as the Evans Redevelopment Agency. While that is a separate legal entity, because of the close nature of the relationship between the city of Evans, it is considered a major fund of the city. But you'll see at the end of the year, your fund balance and all of your governmental funds is about $25.9 million. Some of that is considered restricted. Again, that's your emergency contingency fund, as well as the conservation trust fund monies and other funds that are restricted by outside entities. You also have about $18 million in assigned, including in the general fund, your the council's bond or the council's general fund balance reserve that has been established, and then your unassigned fund balance is about 4.4. And then on the statements of revenues and expenditures and changes in fund balance on page 20 and 21, you'll see your revenues were more than your expenditures, and all of your governmental funds about $3.2 million. So the only fund that had a reduction is the parks construction fund. The rest of them had more revenues than expenditures during the year. The footnotes I won't go into in a lot of detail. There wasn't any significant changes. In the back of the financial statements is budget to actual statements for each of your funds, as well as more information about your pension funds and the required contributions that the city is required to pay into. And with that, I don't have any more that I wanted to share, but if there's any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you very much. Questions or comments? Mayor Pro Tem Clark.
I just want to say that this is a very thorough audit and everything like that. And again, I want to say hats off to the city staff, especially Jackie and her department there. It's another really good audit, and it's really clean and everything. So hats off to them. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Any other comments or questions? I don't have everybody's hand. You're welcome to just open up and talk.
Mayor Rudy, Councilman Neal, it's always nice to just see an unmodified opinion from the auditors on any audited report, and it is very encouraging to see that. I'm not so sure this was happening in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, council member. Any other council members, questions or comments? Well, I just want to echo what Councilmember Neal and Mayor Pro Tem Clark said. Jim, your staff, and Jackie and your staff, thank you for everything you've done. Our financials are in great hands with you guys, and every year you just knock it out of the park. And I'd like to thank ACM for doing this, and what a great report. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes, Jim. Do we have time for the next item for Chief Brandt? I don't know how long he's going to need for that.
Chief, put you on the spot. You want to do a 5-minute summary, or would you like to find a future agenda?
I'm happy to hit just the highlights. I'll be done in less than 5 minutes if council would like.
And we'll let you know, there's a written version that's much longer anyway that will be given to council.
Sure.
So,
and Chief, don't rush it too bad. We can start the meeting a minute or two late. So get in what you need to get in, sir.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim, did you have a preamble?
Well, just the only thing I would say is that both the police department's annual report, which has become our regular update to council, and also the city's annual report were targeted to come out about mid-March. The COVID-19 operations and everything else, and how some of our partners in this have been affected. did shift this schedule, but I will mention that, as I said, both this report and also the city's annual report are for 2019 are forthcoming and will be presented to council or given to council following this session. Take it away, Rick.
Thank you, Jim. Good evening, Mayor and council members. It's nice to see everybody. Hope everybody is well. The annual report this year very much follows the format that we established last year in our reporting, except this time it looks a lot sharper because I didn't do it. I want to just throw out some kudos to some of my staff, Brenda and Rachel and others that participated in putting this thing together. The only mess on it is the front page that I tried to format, so that one I'll accept responsibility for. Next slide, please. Or do I have control of these? Probably don't.
Sharon's probably controlling.
Okay, so community engagement, I just want to briefly touch on that just because it was such I want to call it a banner year. The number of events that we were involved in as a department, the number of officers involved in the events, other city staff for 2019, just great engagement with the community and a lot of engagement from the community with us. It was our first foray into sort of going on steroids with some of our social media, including Twitter. Took that to, we actually put that online, Commander Ramos, who's flying as my wingman right now because I've got really poor internet. So if I get dropped, he's going to pick this up. He got us onto Twitter after he came back from the FBI National Academy. And then Lance has done a great job with our social media presence in Facebook and other formats. So the report has a whole list of events that the officers and city participated in. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on that simply because of the time limitations we have. We had a very successful Citizens Police Academy last year, probably one of the best we've had in quite a while. Some excellent feedback on that. Next slide, please, Karen. Just briefly, for awards and recognitions, Officer Josh Desmond was nominated as Officer of the Year for many, many reasons, and that's detailed in the report. I do want to say, though, that it's a difficult decision for us, especially for last year, because we have so many outstanding officers that finding that Officer of the Year is often a challenge, which is a good position to be in. And then the other officers listed here, Sergeant Harding, Officer O'Brien, Officer Jesmer, and Officer Grant, were all involved in life-saving incidents, and have the ability to save human lives through the application of Narcan and CPR. Karen, next slide, please. Before I get into that one, I do want to recognize one more time the significance of Commander Ramos attending the FBI National Academy. It's a great honor, and I think council's pretty well aware of the difficulty of getting into that and the amount of respect that's associated with that opportunity. One thing I think council maybe does not know is each session, there's 4 sessions per year of 250 people from all over the world that attend this. The FBI want to see a case study that's presented at the academy from one of the representatives in the academy. And this year, or in Dan's session, they took his case of the Perrin murder-suicide, and he had the honor to present that at the FBI National Academy in a formal setting and kind of discuss the challenges that were involved in that case and all the hard work that was put into it. So that was quite an honor for Dan. We had one hire last year. We ended 2019 with 7 vacancies. We hired Officer Driscoll in late 2019. I think it was like December 27th. So we actually entered 2020 with only 6 vacancies, which we are still carrying currently. Let's see, what else have I got? Officer Gallegos received his 5-year service pin. Detective Miramontes, who's not pictured, also received 5 years of service. And John Trahan, Sergeant Trahan, has been here for 15 years and has been doing a great job as a sergeant. Next slide, please, Karen. So just real briefly, the investigations unit. It's comprised of 4 detectives, one of whom is assigned to a regional task force and run by a sergeant. In 2019, the team investigated 98 new cases. We had a few significant cases that are again detailed in the report. Most notably, there was a 1995 cold case homicide that was reopened, and through some really outstanding detective work within the police department and other agencies involved, it looks like we did track down a suspect who's possibly in Mexico, and we're still working on trying to see if we can pin down his whereabouts and get him extradited back. Next slide, please, Karen. Traffic enforcement and patrol. So a couple of things I think I want to discuss just briefly for clarification for council. First off, calls for service were down about 1.5%. They've been pretty steady over the last 4 or 5 years, in that 21 to 24,000 calls per year range. So we saw a slight decrease last year. The traffic accident numbers did go down by 6%, which is always something we want to see. More significantly, our injury accidents decreased by 40%. And again, significantly, our impaired drivers arrests went up 26%. So as council reviews the details of the report, I think what's going to stand out, at least in part, is a drop in overall traffic summonses and warnings. We were not able to staff our traffic unit for the full year because of our staffing levels and having to go to emergency staffing protocols mid-year last year. We did not have full-time traffic officer on the road. So traffic numbers did not meet our expectations because of staffing. But the good news is, even though that was happening, we still were able to address impaired drivers and reduce both injury and non-injury accidents in the city. So good job by the officers working out in the field on short staffing and still being able to make a difference in our community. Next slide, please, Karen. So what council will see as you review this report is what appears to be an 82% decrease in violent crime and a 86% decrease in aggravated assaults. And I think what council needs to be aware of is we're not really seeing a drastic reduction in crime. What's happened is the city, as well as the state and the country, are transitioning to a federal reporting system called NIBRS. It's the national, I can't remember what it is. But anyway, we used to use UCR. Now we've gone to NIBRS. It's a different way of classifying crimes, and specifically addressing aggravated assaults. How NIBRS defines aggravated assaults is different than we've used in the past, and therefore it appears that we've had a significant drop in those numbers. Overall, the overall assaults have not dropped that much. It's just how they're being classified. So thank you. National Incident-Based Reporting System. Thank you, Karen. And then property crime, it was up about 10% over 2018. And the good news was we did see a 9% decrease in motor vehicle thefts. Again, this year, as we've seen in previous years, the clearance rates for all major crimes exceeded state averages. So kudos to the officers and the detectives who are solving crimes at a higher rate than average in the state. I do want to point out also, when you look at the clearance rates on the report, you'll see that for the category of rape, we show 0% clearance rates for 17 through 19. That again is a reporting issue, and it's not an accurate number, but we were unable to get those accurate numbers in time for the report. Next slide, please, Karen. Just real quickly, the officers on the field, this is not having anything to do with the Drug Task Force, had seized about $54,000 worth of illegal drugs last year in the field. So good job by the officers. Next slide, please, Karen. And just briefly, I want to talk about the co-responder program. As council knows, we received a grant for that a couple of years ago. The good news is, for the first time since we've instituted the program, we have all 4 co-responders on staff. Finally happened late last year, so that's good. And we're also seeing an increase in utilization in both Greely and Evans. So we had co-responders assisting officers 163 times on calls, and we're anticipating that number to increase as the co-responders are more and more utilized in both jurisdictions. And next slide, please, Karen. So just briefly, The last page of the document is highlighting goals and objectives for 2020. As you look at the report, you'll see the first goal is a new traffic unit fully staffed. The intent is to have 2 full-time officers in that traffic unit, meaning we'll have police traffic officers out 7 days a week. We're still trying to do that. We're still down 6 positions, and we have 5 individuals in various stages of academy right now, and we have 1 individual we're going to be swearing in next week. So we're hoping by fourth quarter of this year, we're going to have staffing numbers enough up to get that traffic unit fully staffed. We also anticipate opening a special investigations unit attached to the detective unit to help with number 1, investigations within the detective unit, but also to provide a very high level of support for specialized investigations, tracking career criminals in the city, tracking sex offenders, tracking down felony warrants, and that sort of thing. And we think once the staffing numbers are where we need to be, we'll be able to accomplish that. The evidence technician position, as council's aware, we're moving that from a part-time to a full-time position. That process is still moving along a little slowly, but it's moving along, and it's nobody's fault. It's the current environment. The police facility project is still proceeding. The next phases are to identify some potential land that we could build the building on, and once we identify available inventory for potential sites, then the consultant will be looking at overall cost estimates, what we think the entire project is going to cost. So that will be our next phase. Hopefully we can accomplish that this year. And for the short term, because of our staffing levels, once we get staffed in the department, we're kind of tight. We're looking at maybe finding some expansion within this existing facility in the police department or in the city, or possibly some sort of a temporary modular facility to move in operation. So that was a little bit quick, but I'll be happy to entertain and address any questions.
Thank you so much, Chief Brandt. And before I open up for questions, I've said it before and I will continue to say it always. We have the best chief, the best police officers, and the best police department anywhere around. So, Chief Brandt, thank you and all your staff for everything you do. Councilmember Spear.
Thank you, Mayor.
Actually, my comment was kind of an extension off of yours, Mayor Rudy. I have a lot of encounters with our police department, and I just have to say I am so proud of the police. I am so proud of the culture that is in our police department. All of our officers are very responsive, courteous, and not just for myself. I've seen them interact with a lot of other citizens, and I just want to congratulate you and your staff. They are just amazing. Thank you so much. I would not trade our police department for any other police department in the country.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from staff or from council?
Yes, Mayor Rudy. As Chief Brandt, when he first came in, I approached him and I had kind of a very negative experience with the police department over the years in Evans. And when I now see that 3 of the rookies that were introduced to me under the previous police chiefs, and kind of a negative connotation. One's a commander and 2 of them are sergeants now, thanks to Chief Brandt's leadership. And I have totally support for the chief and the officers under his command. He's done an outstanding job in my opinion, in turning this department around, and especially in the area of code enforcement. This is one of the areas back in 2006 where when I talked to a lot of citizens back then, going door to door, that was their number 1 complaint was about code enforcement. And I do realize that's been split a little bit, but he has just done an outstanding job and continues to do an outstanding job in getting his officers the proper training and encouragement to develop community relations, and his work with the charitable things and especially Teresa has just been outstanding. And I think it's starting to show in the amount of interest from the community that attends some of these events that the police put on for them. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Fred. Any other council member questions or comments?
I just want to say that I echo what has been mentioned. I am also proud of our police department. I definitely commend you all and all the time and effort that has been placed with the community engagement. Everything you've done for our community is amazing. It only shows your dedication to our community, and also not just being a police department, but also engaging with our community to show them that we are all here in this together. And I really appreciate your leadership, Chief. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. Anyone else, please?
Just for the sake of time, yeah, I just want to say thank you to the police department. You guys always do a great job, and I support you guys 100%.
Chief Brandt, thank you and your officers again. Fantastic job. Great. We're already past time, so we're going to skip council discussion and head straight to our city council meeting.